My name is Zelda Grace. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked as a patient care coordinator at a mid-sized hospital in Oregon. My job is simple in theory and complex in practice. I handle records, schedules, compliance documentation, and family communications. I live in systems. I live in details. I live in what can be verified. Most people describe me as calm, responsible, a little too composed. If you ask extended family, they'd probably say I'm the steady one, the one who doesn't cause drama, the one who takes care of things quietly, the one who doesn't argue, even when she probably should. My younger sister, Claire, is different. Warmer, louder, more visibly emotional. She fills space in a way I never felt the need to. And when our mother got sick, terminally sick, that difference became a narrative. This story isn't about inheritance. It isn't about sibling rivalry. It isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when grief is weaponized. Because my sister stood in a courtroom and said I abandoned our dying mother. She said I wasn't there. She said I left her to carry the burden alone. And for 12 seconds, the judge believed her. Then I played the hospital's CCTV footage. The courtroom went silent in 12 seconds. Not because I humiliated her. Not because I shouted. But because documentation has a sound when it lands. And it doesn't need volume. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I became the invisible daughter in my own family, how subtle dismissals turned into assumptions, how I convinced myself that staying quiet was maturity, and how one lie, spoken under oath, forced me to choose between preserving family optics and protecting the truth. This isn't a story about destroying my sister. It's a story about evidence, about the cost of letting other people define your presence, and about the quiet power of records when emotions try to rewrite history. I'm not here to dramatize grief. I'm here to document it. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been present for someone in ways no one else noticed? Until someone claimed you weren't there at all? To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand who I was to my family long before our mother ever got sick. In every family, there's an assigned role. Sometimes it's spoken. Most of the time, it's absorbed. Claire was the heart. I was the structure. She cried easily, hugged tightly, remembered birthdays with glitter pens and dramatic phone calls. She made gestures that were visible from across the room. If Mom was stressed, Claire would sit beside her, hold her hand, and say all the right sentimental things. I made spreadsheets. I handled insurance renewals. I set medication reminders. I reorganized Mom's pantry so expiration dates were forward-facing. I knew her primary care physician's extension number by memory. When our father passed 10 years earlier, I was the one who compared funeral package pricing without blinking. No one thanks you for knowing the paperwork. They thank the person who cries the loudest. I don't say that with resentment. It's just how human perception works. We equate visibility with devotion. When Mom was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, Claire cried in the hospital hallway. I asked the oncologist about clinical trial eligibility criteria. Guess which memory stuck with relatives? Guess which one became proof of love? At family gatherings during those first few months, people would squeeze Claire's shoulder and say, "You're being so strong for your mom." To me, they'd say, "Make sure she rests." As if I were an administrative support. As if I were adjacent. I told myself that was fine. Love doesn't need applause. I've never needed the room to shift when I enter it. But there were moments, small ones, when I realized I was slowly becoming a supporting character in a story I was actively living. When Mom's symptoms worsened, I adjusted my work schedule to mornings so I could spend afternoons at the hospital. Claire posted updates online, emotional paragraphs, prayer requests, carefully selected photos. I never posted, so online it looked like she was there every day. Offline, I was the one signing consent forms. The nurses knew me by name. The extended family knew her captions. It didn't feel like betrayal at first. It felt like a division of labor. She expressed, I executed. But over time, the narrative solidified. Claire, the devoted daughter. Zelda, the practical one. There's something quietly dangerous about being labeled the practical one. It suggests you don't feel as deeply, that logistics are a substitute for love, rather than an extension of it. I remember one afternoon in the hospital cafeteria. An aunt leaned toward me and said, almost kindly, "I'm glad Claire has the emotional strength for this." I nodded. I didn't correct her. What would I say? That I wake up at 3 a.m. calculating morphine timing intervals in my head? That I know the exact sound of Mom's breathing pattern before a pain spike? That I've memorized the cadence of her fatigue? Practical doesn't mean detached. It means you're holding yourself together so someone else doesn't have to. But I didn't explain that. Because invisibility, once normalized, feels easier than confrontation. And that's who I was to them. Reliable, efficient, present, but not in a way that photographs well. I didn't realize at the time that perception left uncorrected becomes testimony. And testimony, repeated often enough, begins to feel like fact. The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no moment where I thought, this is the beginning of something breaking. It was small enough that I almost dismissed it. Mom had been in the hospital for 3 weeks when the palliative care team recommended a more structured visitation schedule. She was easily exhausted. Too many visitors meant too much stimulation, too much fatigue afterward. The nurses suggested keeping visits short and staggered. I adjusted my planner that night, color-coded blocks, medication windows, rest periods. Claire's preferred visiting hours, mine. The next afternoon, I arrived at the hospital with a folder of updated insurance authorization forms. Claire was already there. She was sitting by Mom's bed, holding her hand, speaking softly. I stayed back for a moment. I didn't want to interrupt. Claire looked up when she noticed me, and for a second her expression changed, something quick and unreadable, before she smiled. "Oh," she said lightly, "you're here." It was the tone, not surprised, not relieved, just observational. I walked in and placed the folder on the small side table. "I spoke with the billing department this morning," I said. "They needed clarification on the secondary coverage." Claire nodded vaguely. "Of course you did." Then she turned back to Mom. "I was just telling her about the messages people have been sending," she said. "Everyone's praying." Mom squeezed her hand weakly. I stood there, still holding my planner. No one asked what the billing department had said. No one asked how long I'd been on the phone. No one asked if I'd eaten. Again, that wasn't new. I didn't need applause. But then Claire added something. "You know," she said, still facing Mom, "I've basically been living here." The word basically floated in the room. I had been there every afternoon for the last 16 days. I didn't respond. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. Maybe she meant emotionally. Maybe she meant it felt that way to her. But later that evening, I saw her post online. A photo of her holding Mom's hand. Caption, "Day 19. I haven't left her side. Some roles you don't choose. They choose you." I read it twice. 19 days. I counted backward. That included days I had been there while she was at work. Days I had signed documents alone. Days I had sat through lab result explanations. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because she posted, but because she rewrote. It was subtle, not a direct accusation, not a lie anyone could disprove easily. Just an inflation. And here's what hurt most. I considered commenting. Just something neutral. We're both doing our best. But I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I told myself grief distorts memory. I told myself that correcting something so small would look petty. So I did what I always did. I documented privately. That night, I added a note in my planner. March 14th, 1:10 p.m. Arrived. Claire present. Left at 5:40 p.m. Billing authorization confirmed. Not because I planned to use it. Just because details matter. The next week, it happened again. A relative called me and said, "Claire told me she's barely sleeping. She hasn't left the hospital." I was in the hospital parking lot when they said it. Claire had left 2 hours earlier for dinner with friends. I remember sitting in my car, keys still in the ignition, feeling something quiet settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern beginning to form, and patterns, if left alone, grow roots. That was the first small cut. Not loud enough to demand attention, but sharp enough that I felt it. And instead of confronting it, I adjusted. I stayed quieter. I told myself the truth didn't need defense. I didn't realize that silence, when repeated, becomes consent to someone else's version. The human mind has a remarkable ability to smooth over discomfort. We rename it, we reframe it, we shrink it down until it fits into something easier to carry. That's what I did. After that first small cut, I told myself Claire wasn't rewriting history, she was coping. Grief makes people dramatic. Stress makes people exaggerate. I work in a hospital. I've seen families fracture under less. So when the comments continued, I adjusted my interpretation instead of addressing the behavior. When relatives began calling Claire Mom's Rock, I told myself they simply didn't see the behind-the-scenes labor. When friends messaged her, praising her devotion, I told myself devotion doesn't need an audience. When she told an aunt within earshot, "I don't know what Mom would do without me here every day," I reminded myself that presence can feel exclusive even when it isn't. I rationalized so often that it became muscle memory. Meanwhile, the hospital staff knew the reality. The night nurse once said to me quietly, "You're here more consistently than anyone." I smiled and said, "We're both doing what we can." That became my standard line. We're both doing what we can. It sounded balanced, mature, fair. But balance requires symmetry. And slowly, asymmetry was becoming undeniable. Claire began referring to decisions as if she were the default authority. "She wants to try the new pain regimen," Claire would say to extended family. In reality, Mom had looked at me when the doctor explained the side effects. I had asked the follow-up questions. I had explained the trade-offs, but Claire narrated it afterward. And narration shapes memory. One afternoon, during a family visit, an uncle asked about the next chemotherapy session. Before I could respond, Claire answered, "I've been handling that." I was the one coordinating appointment times around Mom's fatigue cycles. I was the one reviewing blood work thresholds. I opened my mouth, then I closed it, because correcting her in front of others would feel like competition. And I refused to compete over our mother's illness. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, through your own reluctance to create tension. I told myself, this is temporary. When this is over, none of this will matter. But illness has a way of revealing long-standing dynamics. Claire began tagging herself at the hospital on social media, writing updates like "another night by her side," even on evenings when I was there and she had left early. I would scroll, pause, and then put my phone down. I started noticing how often she used singular pronouns. "I'm doing everything I can." "I'm not leaving her." "I'm exhausted." Never "we." At first, I interpreted it as an oversight. Then I realized it was consistent. Consistency is rarely accidental. Still, I stayed silent. Because I believed silence was maturity. Because I believed correcting the narrative would make me seem defensive. Because I believed the people who mattered would know the truth. But here's something I've learned from working in medical systems. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. And if it isn't publicly visible, it's easily replaced. I began keeping more detailed notes in my planner. Arrival times, departure times, conversations with physicians, not for confrontation, just clarity. There's a difference. I didn't yet feel threatened, but I felt something shifting. The way relatives looked at Claire, with admiration. The way they looked at me, with expectation. As if my role was administrative support to her emotional heroism. I began to notice small things. Claire would arrive when visitors were scheduled. She would leave when it was just Mom and me. She positioned herself where she could be seen. I positioned myself where work needed to be done. And slowly, invisibility stopped being incidental. It became structural. The most dangerous part? I participated in it. I allowed the imbalance to continue because I valued peace over correction. I thought we were grieving the same loss. I didn't realize we were building two entirely different records of the same time. And one day, those records would collide. There's a moment in every long-term crisis when you stop reacting and start recognizing patterns. For me, it happened on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic occurred. No argument, no accusation, just a quiet realization as I sat in a vinyl hospital chair, reviewing medication adjustments while Claire updated her followers online. I wasn't just being overlooked, I had been assigned a role. Reliable, efficient, emotionally steady, invisible. Families don't consciously distribute these parts. They emerge through repetition. Claire had become the visible daughter, the expressive one, the grieving one, the one whose presence could be photographed and captioned. I had become infrastructure. If something needed to be signed, they looked at me. If insurance pushed back, I handled it. If a nurse needed clarification on advance directives, they asked for me. But when relatives arrived, they turned toward Claire. "How are you holding up?" "You must be exhausted." "You're so strong for your mom." To me, "Can you grab the doctor? Can you print that form? Can you check if she needs anything?" I don't resent responsibility. Responsibility is honest. It's measurable. What unsettled me was how quickly my presence became functional rather than relational. Even Mom, in her fading strength, would sometimes squeeze Claire's hand when visitors were present, not because she loved her more, but because Claire's emotion filled the room in a way mine never did. After visitors left, Mom would look at me and ask quietly, "Did you eat today?" She knew. She always knew. But other people rarely see what isn't performed. One evening, Claire said something that clarified everything. We were standing into the hallway after meeting with the oncologist. The prognosis had shifted. Time frames were shorter now. Claire leaned against the wall and sighed dramatically. "I don't know how I'm going to keep doing this alone." Alone. I was holding the discharge planning packet in my hands. For a second, I thought she misspoke. But she didn't correct it. She didn't glance at me apologetically. She just kept talking. "I've basically taken over everything," she added, almost casually. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. She wasn't forgetting my presence. She was replacing it. and the more I stayed silent, the more solid her version became. I realized then that roles are not just assigned by others, they are reinforced by compliance. I had accepted the part of quiet support. I had mistaken restraint for dignity. But restraint, when prolonged, becomes self-erasure. That night, I sat in my car before driving home and asked myself a question I hadn't allowed myself before. If something goes wrong, if decisions are questioned later, who will they believe? The daughter who narrated her devotion publicly, or the daughter who kept receipts privately? I didn't yet suspect we would end up in a courtroom. But I began to understand something foundational. In every family story, there's the visible character and the structural one. Visible characters are remembered. Structural ones are assumed. And assumptions are fragile. I went home and reorganized my planner. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just deliberately. I added a new section, hospital log, dated, timestamped, factual. Again, not for confrontation, for accuracy, because for the first time, I understood that my role was not just being assigned. It was being archived. And if I didn't preserve my version carefully, it would dissolve under someone else's narrative. That was the night I stopped being simply the reliable one. That was the night I began paying attention. The shift didn't happen in public. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and warmed linen, under fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly when everything else was quiet. Mom was asleep. Claire had left early that afternoon. She said she had a migraine. I believed her. I didn't question it. By then, I had stopped questioning most things. I sat in the chair beside Mom's bed with my planner open on my lap, reviewing the next week's projected care schedule. The palliative team had adjusted her pain management again. The numbers were precise: milligrams, time intervals, risk factors. I liked precision. Precision doesn't misremember. Mom stirred slightly and opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked confused, the way patients sometimes do when sleep and medication blur the edges of reality. Then she focused on me. "You're still here," she whispered. "I am," I said softly. She studied my face in a way that made me feel younger than 36, like a child being evaluated gently. "You don't have to do everything," she said. It wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't pity. It was awareness. I smiled. "I'm not doing everything." She exhaled faintly, almost amused. "You never argue." I hesitated. She was right. I didn't argue. Not with Claire. Not with relatives. Not even with narratives that subtly removed me, because arguing felt like lowering myself into noise. But something in her tone made me ask quietly, "Do you think I should?" Mom's eyes closed for a second, then reopened. "I think," she said slowly, "that quiet isn't the same as small." The sentence lingered between us. Quiet isn't the same as small. For years, I had allowed people to confuse the two. I thought composure meant invisibility. I thought maturity meant non-interference. I thought dignity required silence. But silence is neutral only until someone fills it. Claire had been filling it, not maliciously, not in some theatrical villain way, but steadily, incrementally. And I had allowed it because I didn't want conflict during a crisis. That afternoon, sitting beside my mother's hospital bed, I realized something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't protecting peace. It was creating an imbalance, not because I was weak, but because I was absent from the narrative of my own presence. Mom reached for my hand. "You're the one who knows the details," she said. "You always have." It was simple, factual, affirming, and something shifted inside me, not outwardly, not dramatically, but structurally. I stopped thinking of myself as the overlooked daughter. I started thinking of myself as the documented one. There's power in that distinction. Victims wait for recognition. Documented people don't require it. When Claire returned later that evening, she kissed Mom's forehead and said brightly, "I'm back." I looked up from my chair and nodded. No tension, no accusation. But internally, I had crossed a line. I was no longer observing the pattern passively. I was cataloging it deliberately, not to attack, not to expose, but to ensure that if perception ever hardened into accusation, I wouldn't be defenseless. That was the day something shifted. Externally, nothing changed. I still spoke calmly. I still handled paperwork. I still let Claire narrate to relatives. But internally, I stopped shrinking myself to preserve comfort. I stopped assuming truth would defend itself. Because truth without structure is fragile. And I knew structure. That night, I added one more line to my planner. Quiet isn't small, not as a warning, as a reminder. After that afternoon with Mom, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been reflexive, automatic, a personality trait mistaken for maturity. Now it has become intentional. There's a difference between not speaking because you're afraid of disruption and not speaking because you're collecting clarity. Claire didn't notice the shift. Why would she? Externally, I behaved the same. I still arrived in the afternoons. I still coordinated with nurses. I still answered relatives' questions without contradicting her. But internally, I stopped giving her the benefit of the assumption. When she said, "I've been here all day," I no longer told myself she meant emotionally. I checked the visitor log. When she told an aunt, I handled the medication change. I no longer assumed oversight. I noted the timestamp of my consultation with the attending physician, not obsessively, not bitterly, just accurately. Working in a hospital teaches you something essential. Documentation isn't aggression, it's protection. It's how systems defend themselves against confusion. And slowly, I began treating our family dynamic like a system. I watched patterns. Claire's visits clustered around visible hours, late mornings, early evenings, when relatives were most likely to stop by. She was rarely there during the long, quiet stretches between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., when Mom's discomfort spiked and paperwork piled up. I was, but I no longer felt invisible in those hours. I felt positioned, because while she narrated, I accumulated a record. One evening, a cousin stopped me in the hallway. "I don't know how Claire does it," she said. "Being there nonstop like this?" I looked at her gently. "She's doing what she can," I replied. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't a submission. It was neutrality. And neutrality, when deliberate, is powerful. The more Claire amplified her role publicly, the calmer I became privately. Not because I was planning retaliation, because I began to sense something subtle but inevitable. If the narrative ever hardened, if someone formally questioned decisions, finances, medical directives, the person with timestamps would matter more than the person with testimonials. I didn't yet know how far things would escalate, but I felt the tension building in small ways. Claire began speaking more confidently about Mom's wishes, even when those wishes had been documented in advanced directive forms I helped complete. She once said to a nurse, "Mom doesn't want that," without consulting the paperwork. I quietly handed the nurse the signed document. No confrontation, no correction, just paper. The nurse nodded and adjusted accordingly. Claire didn't look at me, but I noticed something in her posture: tightness. Silence, when it refuses to collapse, unsettles people who rely on performance. I wasn't challenging her publicly. I was simply refusing to disappear. And there's a particular discomfort that arises when someone you've quietly overwritten stops erasing themselves. Still, I never accused her. Never called her out in front of family. Never posted rebuttals online. I chose something more irreversible than argument. I chose patience. Patience backed by documentation. Because in my world, stories don't win disputes. Records do. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet awareness was forming. If she ever went too far, if exaggeration turned into accusation, I would not need to defend myself emotionally. I would simply present facts. And fact does not require volume. That was when silence stopped being my weakness. It became my strategy. Preparation never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like a habit. It looks like someone who simply cares a lot about details. And that's exactly how I let it appear. By this point, Mom's condition had stabilized into a fragile rhythm: good mornings, difficult afternoons, unpredictable nights. The hospital had implemented stricter visitor check-in procedures due to policy changes. Every person entering the oncology wing scanned an ID badge. Every entry was time-stamped. Most people ignored systems like that. I never did. One afternoon, while waiting for a nurse to print updated lab results, I noticed the small screen at the security desk listing visitor entries in real time. Name, time in, time out, clear, undeniable. I didn't react visibly. I simply asked casually, "Are visitor logs archived digitally?" The security coordinator nodded. 30 days accessible locally, longer in central storage. That was all I needed to know. I didn't request copies. Not yet. But I understood something important. The hospital documented the presence objectively. Not emotionally. Not narratively. Objectively. Around the same time, I began noticing inconsistencies in Claire's updates. She would post about another sleepless night at the hospital on evenings when visitor logs showed she'd left before 7 p.m. Again, I didn't comment. I didn't screenshot her posts with outrage. I cross-referenced quietly. Date, time, claim. Not to expose. To verify. Preparation for me was never about catching her in a lie. It was about protecting myself from one. There's a difference. I also deepened my communication with staff. Not in a manipulative way, but transparently. When doctors discussed treatment adjustments, I asked them to summarize key points in the patient portal messages. When discharge planning conversations happened, I requested written follow-ups. Just for clarity, I would say, clarity is a neutral word. It doesn't threaten anyone, but clarity accumulates weight. Claire, meanwhile, grew more confident in her storytelling. She began using phrases like, I've been coordinating everything, even when decisions had been signed off through joint consent. I watched carefully, not her emotions but her language, because language reveals intention long before action does. The most telling moment came during a brief meeting with a hospital social worker about long-term hospice options. Claire spoke first. "I've basically been her primary caregiver this entire time," she said. The social worker looked at both of us. "Are you co-designated in the file?" she asked. I handed over the paperwork. "Both our names. Equal legal standing." Claire smiled thinly. "Of course," she said. We're both involved?" "We're both involved." It was the first time in weeks she had used plural language. Not because she wanted to, because documentation required it. That's when I understood something subtle but critical. As long as the conversation was emotional, she controlled the narrative. The moment it entered structured systems, parity reappeared. And systems were my environment. I began organizing my planner differently. Not just timestamps. Context. Screenshots of appointment confirmations are saved to a secure folder. Copies of consent forms are backed up digitally. Emails exported. Again, no anger, no revenge. Just architecture. You don't build architecture overnight. You build it quietly, beam by beam, while everyone assumes you're just maintaining routine. No one noticed. Claire didn't notice because she believed visibility was power. Relatives didn't notice because they saw only the emotional front stage. Even hospital staff didn't fully notice, because to them, I was simply thorough. But something inside me had shifted from reactive to prepared. I wasn't waiting for conflict. I was insulating myself against distortion, because deep down, beneath the spreadsheets and planner tabs, I sensed the trajectory. Exaggeration was increasing. Language was inflating. And inflation, if unchecked, eventually collapses. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew this. If the day ever came when someone formally asked, "Who was there?" I would not answer with emotion. I would answer with evidence, and evidence once revealed cannot be argued with. The leverage didn't arrive like a discovery. It unfolded like confirmation. Mom passed away on a quiet Sunday morning. No dramatic final words, no cinematic reconciliation, just a steady exhale that didn't reverse. Claire was there that morning, so was I. For once, we occupied the same moment without narrative competing for space. Grief has a way of temporarily equalizing people. The days that followed were procedural. Death certificates, funeral arrangements, legal paperwork. I handled most of the documentation because that had always been my lane. Claire handled the eulogies, the calls, the public announcements. On the surface, it looked balanced, but grief also loosens tongues. About 2 weeks after the funeral, an extended family member called me. Her tone was hesitant. "I don't want to get involved," she began, which is how people always begin when they're already involved. "But Claire's been saying you weren't around much at the end." I felt something still inside me. Not shock, not outrage. Stillness. "She's been telling people she basically carried everything alone," the relative added gently. "That you stepped back." Stepped back. The phrase landed differently than exaggeration. It implied absence. It implied abandonment. I thanked her for telling me. Then I hung up and opened my laptop. This was the first time I intentionally accessed the hospital's archived visitor logs. I requested them formally through internal compliance channels. I didn't explain why. I simply cited personal record reconciliation. Within days, I had a digital file. Every entry, every exit, 32 days of documented visitation during Mom's final stretch. I printed them, not dramatically, not with shaking hands, just methodically. Then I did something I hadn't needed to do before. I compared them against Claire's public posts, date by date, claim by claim. There it was. Multiple nights she described sleeping in the hospital when logs showed she left before evening quiet hours. Days she claimed to be present continuously when timestamps revealed 4-hour gaps. Statements to relatives about handling everything alone on dates where my entry preceded hers and my exit followed. It wasn't a single misremembered moment. It was a pattern of narrative inflation. And here's the part that mattered most. If she had simply needed emotional validation, I would have let it go. But she wasn't just processing grief. She was establishing a version of events. A version where I was peripheral. A version where she was singular. That's when the private reveal crystallized. The leverage wasn't about humiliation. It was about protection. Because exaggeration inside family gossip is one thing. Exaggeration inside legal proceedings is another. And I began hearing subtle shifts in conversation. Claire is asking about estate distribution based on caregiving contributions. Claire mentioned to an aunt that she sacrificed her job stability to be there constantly. Statements that, if formalized, could influence probate perceptions. That's when clarity settled in fully. This wasn't about emotional recognition anymore. It was about legal narrative. And legal narrative requires evidence. I sat at my kitchen table with the printed logs stacked neatly beside my planner. No adrenaline, no triumph, just certainty. For months, I had documented without knowing whether I'd ever need it. Now I knew. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was precise. It was time-stamped. It didn't accuse. It simply contradicts. And contradiction, when backed by system records, doesn't need volume. I closed the folder and placed it in my desk drawer, not to use immediately, not to threaten, but to hold. Because once you realize the story being built about you is inaccurate, you have two choices. Ignore it and hope it fades, or prepare for the moment it solidifies. I chose preparation. Quietly, completely, and without telling anyone. There's a particular kind of tension that settles over a situation before it becomes irreversible. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It hums. I felt it the day I received formal notice from Claire's attorney. The envelope was thin, professional, unemotional. She was contesting elements of the estate distribution, citing disproportionate caregiving burden and primary end-of-life responsibility. The language was careful, strategic. It did not accuse me directly of abandonment, but it implied absence. An implication in a legal context is deliberate. I sat at my dining table with the letter laid flat in front of me. My planner was beside it, as always. I read the document twice, slowly. Then I closed my eyes. This was the fork in the road. Option 1. Negotiate quietly. Accept a narrative adjustment in exchange for peace. Allow her version to stand publicly while privately correcting financial distribution. Option 2. Formally contest the claim, introduce hospital documentation, and permanently alter the family dynamic. There is no version of option 2 that preserves illusion. And illusions, once shattered, don't reform. I didn't think about money first. I thought about the record. If I allowed the implication to stand legally, it would become an archived truth. Court documents don't just settle disputes. They freeze narratives. I asked myself a simple question. Can I live with an official version of events that states I was not present? The answer came immediately. No, not because I needed validation, but because of absence, once formalized, stains. I drafted my response carefully. No emotional language, no counter-accusations. Just one statement. I dispute the claim of primary caregiving status and will provide documented visitation and involvement records upon request. I didn't attach the logs yet. I didn't escalate prematurely. I simply signaled that evidence existed. Within days, mediation was scheduled. Claire called me once during that period. Her voice was tight but controlled. I don't understand why you're making this harder than it needs to be, she said. I kept my tone even. I'm not making it harder, I'm clarifying. There was a pause. You know I was there constantly, she said. I know when you were there, I replied. Silence stretched between us. She didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. That was the moment I understood something critical. She believed her narrative had gone unchallenged long enough to solidify. She didn't know it had been recorded. Mediation failed quickly. Her attorney pressed the claim of disproportionate involvement. My attorney, calm, methodical, asked a single question. Do we want to request institutional visitor logs? That was the irreversible choice. Once requested formally, the logs would become part of the case record. Once entered, they would be undeniable. Once undeniable, they would expose the discrepancy fully. Not dramatically, but conclusively. I felt the weight of it. Not fear, finality. Because this wasn't just about the division of assets. It was about confronting a constructed story with structured truth. I looked at my attorney and nodded. Yes, I said, request them. That was the point of no return. Not loud, not theatrical, just a signature on a procedural motion. From that moment forward, the outcome would no longer depend on memory. It would depend on timestamps, and timestamps don't negotiate. Once the formal request was filed, everything became procedural. There's something almost anticlimactic about escalation when it happens through paperwork. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Just filings, acknowledgments, compliance requests, deadlines. The hospital's legal department responded within 10 business days. Visitor logs, entry scans, exit scans, archived security summaries. And one more thing I hadn't initially considered. CCTV retention logs. Not full footage of every hallway. That would have been invasive and unnecessary. But timestamp verification clips tied to visitor badge scans at oncology wing access points. Objective. Institutional. Neutral. My attorney reviewed the material first. He didn't react emotionally. He simply highlighted sections. On these dates, he said calmly, your sister claimed continuous presence. He pointed to multiple log gaps. 4 hours, 6 hours, entire evenings. Meanwhile, he continued, your entries show daily consistency. He wasn't impressed. He was satisfied. Satisfied is a dangerous word when you're used to being underestimated. We prepared the submission carefully. No commentary, no accusation of dishonesty, just comparison charts. Claimed caregiving timeline versus documented visitation data. Structured, clear, undeniable. Meanwhile, outwardly, I remained unchanged. I went to work. I handled discharge planning for patients. I attended family dinners when invited. I didn't discuss the case with relatives. Claire, however, began increasing her narrative intensity. Subtle at first. Comments like, "It's hard when your own family doesn't recognize what you did." Ambiguous statements that invited sympathy without specifics. She still believed perception was leverage. What she didn't realize was that perception loses power once documentation enters the record. The hearing date was set, not a full trial yet, a preliminary evidentiary review. That's when the phrase entered my life. My sister lied in court saying I abandoned our dying mother, so I played the hospital CCTV showing she never visited. It wasn't something I said publicly. It was how the situation crystallized internally, because that's what it had become. She formalized the narrative. I formalized the rebuttal. The morning of the hearing, I wore the same kind of tailored blazer I'd worn to hospital administrative meetings for years. Neutral, structured, composed. Claire arrived early, surrounded by two relatives offering quiet support. She looked tired, determined, confident. She believed her story had emotional weight, and emotional weight often persuades, until it meets the record. When she testified, her voice trembled at the right moments. "I was there every day," she said. "I barely left the hospital. I handled everything alone at the end." I didn't interrupt. My attorney waited. Then he stood. "Your Honor, we would like to submit institutional visitor logs and access point CCTV verification timestamps from the oncology wing. No theatrics, no accusation, just submission." Claire's attorney objected briefly on procedural grounds. Overruled. The clerk distributed printed copies, charts, dates, times. The courtroom air shifted subtly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. And then the verification clip was cued. Not a montage, not humiliation, just time-stamped badge scans cross-referenced with corridor footage, confirming presence and absence. The judge leaned forward slightly. 12 seconds. That's how long it took. 12 seconds for silence to replace assumption. 12 seconds for the narrative to lose oxygen. The courtroom went silent, in 12 seconds. Not because anyone shouted, but because documentation doesn't argue. It concludes. Claire didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. There was no triumph in my chest, only stillness. Because I hadn't come to win, I had come to correct. And correction, once entered into the record, doesn't need emotion. It just needs clarity. Silence in a courtroom has a texture. It's not dramatic, it's not explosive, it's dense. After the footage stopped, no one spoke for a few seconds longer than necessary. The judge reviewed the printed logs again. Claire's attorney flipped pages more quickly than before. No one accused her of lying outright. That wasn't required. The discrepancy spoke for itself. The judge's voice, when it came, was measured. "These records indicate consistent visitation by both parties," he said. "The claim of exclusive or primary physical presence is not supported by institutional documentation." Not supported? Such restrained language for something so definitive. Claire's shoulders lowered slightly, not in collapse, more like recalibration. The confidence she had entered with softened into something less certain. The hearing ended without drama. The estate distribution remained aligned with the original will, equal. No penalties, no public reprimand, just record the correction. But consequences don't always arrive in rulings. They arrive in the atmosphere. Outside the courthouse, relatives stood in small clusters. No one approached me immediately. They weren't hostile. They were unsettled. When perception fractures, people don't know where to place their sympathy. One aunt approached Claire first. "Maybe it was just stress," she said quietly, as if smoothing fabric. Claire nodded, eyes glassy. I stood a few steps away, not waiting for acknowledgement. Eventually, the same aunt turned to me. "I didn't realize you were there that much," she said. There it was. Not an apology. Recognition. And recognition, when delayed, feels strangely hollow. I replied simply. No elaboration, no recounting, just a fact. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted in family gatherings. Claire spoke less confidently about carrying everything alone. The phrases softened into shared language. We both did what we could. It was the first time in months she used that sentence publicly without prompting. But trust, once strained, doesn't reset automatically. Relatives who had once praised her devotion now avoided detailed discussions about that period. Not because they resented her, but because they had participated in an inaccurate narrative. People don't like confronting their own misperceptions. I noticed other changes too. Claire stopped posting about caregiving entirely. Old posts quietly disappeared. Not all of them, just enough. There was no confrontation between us during this period. No explosive argument in a parking lot. No dramatic confession. Just distance. Distance shaped by evidence. One evening, about a month after the hearing, a cousin messaged me privately. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't know." I stared at the message for a long time. She hadn't accused me directly before. She had simply believed what was presented. Belief follows visibility. I typed back, "It's okay, grief distorts a lot of things." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Grief distorts. Narrative amplifies. Documentation corrects. The real consequence wasn't financial. It was structural. Claire no longer controlled the story uncontested, and I no longer felt compelled to defend myself emotionally. The family dynamic had shifted from assumption to caution. People ask more questions now. They verified. They paused before praising. And Claire, for the first time in years, seemed unsure of how to occupy the space she once filled so confidently. Not destroyed. Not humiliated. Just recalibrated. Consequences rarely look like punishment. Sometimes they look like silence where certainty used to be. And that silence lingers longer than any verdict. There's a moment, after something has been formally corrected, when people begin trying to retroactively soften it. Not publicly, privately. That moment arrived about 6 weeks after the hearing. Claire asked to meet, not at the house, not at a family gathering, a neutral coffee shop downtown, the kind with muted lighting and low conversations, safe for delicate discussions. She arrived first. I could tell by the way she was already seated, fingers wrapped tightly around a cup that had likely gone cold. I sat down across from her. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said finally. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was strained. "I didn't either," I replied. That was true. I hadn't wanted escalation. I had wanted accuracy. She looked down at the table. "I wasn't trying to erase you," she said. "It just felt like I was carrying everything." I believed her. Emotionally, she may have felt that way. But feelings, once turned into legal statements, become claims. And claims demand support. "I know you felt overwhelmed," I said evenly. "But saying I wasn't there changes more than feelings." She nodded slowly. "I didn't realize you kept records." There it was. Not regret about the claim itself. Surprise at the documentation. I held her gaze gently. "I didn't keep them for you," I said. "I kept them for clarity." Another long pause. "I've been getting questions," she admitted. People asking why the logs looked different than what I told them. That was the true consequence, not the court. Reputation recalibration. Once evidence enters family systems, it doesn't disappear. It lingers in subtle hesitations, in altered tone, in cautious phrasing. "I never wanted to make you look bad," she added quietly. "I didn't want to make you look bad either," I replied. "I wanted the record to be accurate." Accuracy can feel like an accusation when someone has grown comfortable with exaggeration. She inhaled deeply. "I think I just needed to feel like I mattered more," she said. That was the most honest thing she had said all afternoon. And for a moment, I felt something close to sadness, not anger, because this wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about money. It was about visibility. She had built an identity around being the devoted daughter, and when documentation challenged that exclusivity, it destabilized more than her legal claim. It destabilized her self-image. But here's the quiet truth. It was too late to repair the original fracture. Not because I refused forgiveness, but trust doesn't repair through apology alone. It repairs through restraint moving forward. "I don't want us to be enemies," she said. "We're not," I answered. That was also true. Enemies imply ongoing battle. We weren't fighting anymore. We were simply no longer pretending. When we left the coffee shop, there was no hug, no dramatic reconciliation, just acknowledgement. But something irreversible had settled between us. Before the court, I had been the invisible one. After the court, I was the documented one. And once documentation exposes narrative inflation, you can't return to unquestioned belief. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. But it was final in its own quiet way. Some things, once clarified, can't be blurred again. The real confrontation didn't happen in court. It happened 3 months later at Thanksgiving. First major holiday without Mom. Grief changes the atmosphere of a room. But so does unresolved history. Claire and I arrived separately. The house felt smaller without Mom's presence filling it. Relatives moved carefully around us, as if any sudden emotional movement might reopen something fragile. Dinner passed without incident. Polite conversation, safe topics, no references to court, no references to that time. It was almost impressive how thoroughly everyone avoided it. After dessert, Claire approached me in the kitchen while I was rinsing plates. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I turned off the water and faced her. There was no audience, no performance opportunity, just fluorescent light and the hum of a refrigerator. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how things got to that point." I waited. "I think I started believing my own version," she admitted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tearful. It was analytical, and I appreciated that. When people kept praising me, she continued, I leaned into it. I didn't mean to push you out, but I did. Her voice didn't shake. There was no attempt to reclaim moral ground, just acknowledgement. I nodded slowly. I let it happen, I said. She looked surprised. You didn't make the claims, she said. No, I replied, but I didn't correct them early. This wasn't self-blame. It was context. Silence, I had learned, shapes outcomes as much as speech. She crossed her arms loosely, not defensive, just holding herself. I felt invisible growing up, she said. You were always the competent one, the dependable one. I think, when Mom got sick, I didn't want to be the background anymore. There it was, not rivalry, rebalancing. She hadn't tried to destroy me. She had tried to elevate herself, at my expense. I never saw you as background, I said calmly. I know, she answered, but I saw myself that way. Confrontations without heat are rare. They require both people to abandon the need to win. I didn't need her humiliation. She didn't need my forgiveness performance. We stood there in quiet honesty. I shouldn't have said you weren't there, she said finally. That's all I needed you to understand, I replied. No lecture, no recap of evidence, no mention of the courtroom, because that part had already concluded. I don't know how to fix it, she added. You don't, I said gently. You move differently from here. Repair isn't a speech. It's altered behavior over time. She nodded once. We didn't hug. But the tension that had once felt sharp now felt defined. Defined as manageable. Ambiguity is corrosive. When we returned to the dining room, nothing looked different. Relatives continued conversations. Plates clinked softly. But something fundamental had shifted. Not dominance, not victory. Alignment. For the first time since Mom's illness began, our understanding of events matched reality. Not her version. Not mine. Reality. And reality, when accepted without theatrics, doesn't require punishment. It requires adjustment. That was our confrontation. No raised voices. No accusations. Just clarity. And clarity, once spoken calmly, carries farther than anger ever could. It's been 2 years since the courtroom. 2 years since the 12 seconds of silence that redefined everything. If you had asked me before all of this who I was, I would have said reliable, practical, quiet. I would have described myself through function. Now I describe myself differently. Not louder, not harder, just clearer. I am not the invisible daughter. I am not the documented daughter. I am the woman who understands the difference between silence as fear and silence as choice. That distinction changed me more than the hearing ever did. For a long time, I believed strength meant absorbing misperception without correction. That composure required endurance. That dignity meant letting others speak first, and sometimes last. Now I understand something subtler. You don't have to perform your devotion, but you do have to protect your truth. Those are not the same thing. Claire and I are functional, not inseparable, not estranged. Functional in a way that feels adult. We speak. We coordinate holidays. We don't revisit the courtroom unless logistics require it. There is no bitterness in my voice when I say her name. There's also no erasure. The biggest change isn't in how others see me. It's in how I respond when someone begins to mischaracterize my role in something. At work, I speak earlier now, not aggressively, just clearly. If a contribution is attributed incorrectly, I correct it gently in the moment, not to embarrass, to anchor. Because I learned that narratives form quickly, and once formed, they harden. I no longer wait for distortion to become formal before I clarify. That's growth, not retaliation. I still keep a planner, still color code, still prefer structure over spectacle, but I don't confuse composure with disappearance anymore. When I think about Mom now, I don't think about court. I think about that afternoon in her hospital room. Quiet isn't the same as small, she said. She was right. Quiet can be expensive. Quiet can be deliberate. Quiet can be immovable. What happened between Claire and me wasn't a story about revenge. It was about recalibration. About two adults renegotiating identity under pressure. I don't feel victorious. Victory implies defeat. No one lost. But something false dissolved. And in its place, something steadier remains. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this. Documentation isn't distrust. It's self-respect. And self-respect, once strengthened, doesn't require applause. It requires consistency. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder, just unwilling to let my presence be rewritten. When people hear the sentence, my sister lied in court saying I abandoned our dying mother, so I played the hospital CCTV showing she never visited. They expect drama. They expect shouting, humiliation, a cinematic takedown. But the truth is quieter than that. The courtroom went silent in 12 seconds. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to win, but when emotion meets evidence, it lowers its voice. This story was never about destroying my sister. It was about refusing to let absence be written over my presence. Grief is complicated. Identity is fragile. And sometimes, in trying to feel significant, people unintentionally diminish others. Claire didn't wake up one day planning to erase me. She leaned into praise. She accepted a narrative that made her feel needed. And I stayed silent long enough for that narrative to grow teeth. We both learned something. She learned that visibility without accuracy eventually collapses. I learned that silence without boundaries invites distortion. There's a difference between being peaceful and being passive. There's a difference between humility and self-erasure. And there's a difference between correcting someone and humiliating them. I chose correction, calmly, legally, structurally. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to perform your loyalty loudly. You don't have to compete for grief. But you do have to protect your record. Because once a story enters official space, courtrooms, contracts, testimonies, it stops being emotional memory and starts becoming historical fact. And facts matter, especially when they carry your name. So I'll leave you with the question that stayed with me long after the hearing ended. If someone rewrote your presence in their story, would you stay silent for peace? Or would you calmly present the truth? Tell me in the comments.